This is the third in a four-part series, which tells the story of the 2nd Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment's role within Operation Michael, that being the opening phase of the 1918 German spring offensives. 3 days of heavy fighting had seen huge losses on both sides. The British had been driven from the main battle zone, with sections of the almost non-existent rear zone also being overrun, and several British divisions were already a mere shell of their former selves. In the Bedfords area of the battle, the Canal de la Somme had been breached at Somme, and outflanking manoeuvres from the open northern and southern flanks were threatening the entire 18 Corps line. Overnight, with the 61st Division largely removed from the firing line, the 20th Division became the Corps' northernmost unit, with the 8th Division of 19 Corps to their north, the 30th Division holding the centre around Somme, and the 36th Division were in the south, having made contact again. The 8th Division had to deal with several incursions during the night, courtesy of the marshes and rivers being easily passable and the thick undergrowth providing cover for the German forces looking for weak points. Crossings at XIX Corps and St. Christ were repelled, but the German footholds at Epanancourt and Pargny could not be dealt with, and as the day developed, pressure from these bridgeheads was increased. South of Somme, a heavy machine gun and artillery barrage around Verlin around 12:50 am put the Bedfords and Royal Scots Fusiliers on high alert, but no further actions developed, so they returned to patrolling and preparing for the coming day's fighting. At 4:45, the 30th Division ordered the Royal Scots Fusiliers to advance their lines towards the Somme-Golencourt road to support the 89th Brigade's right flank, but when German forces met with their patrols, a halt was called and a defensive line taken up. By 6 am, the overnight mist had all but cleared, and the German assaults began all along the line in earnest. 19 Corps' 8th Division, holding the canal north of the 20th Division, had their lines breached overnight when German stormtroopers crossed the canal by rafts and fallen trees north of Bethencourt. 18 Corps diary rather testily recorded, "As the 8th Division did not appear able to deal with the situation, the GOC 20th Division was ordered to counter-attack and restore the situation at this point." At 10:15, German forces had reorganised and regained the position, but were once again counter-attacked back across the canal by the 20th Division. Further crossings on the 8th Division's front at St. Christ and north of Eterpigny were driven back, but a bridgehead in the gap of the lines north of Pargny could not be held, and the canal lines started to buckle. In the Corps south, the 36th Division's overstretched lines were attacked at 6 in the morning, the German troops gaining Golencourt and constantly finding and engaging the 36th Division's open flanks with small teams of light machine gunners until the outflanked British were forced to retire to the next defensible position. In doing so, the now wide open southern flank of the 30th Division was exposed even further, the division's troops already being heavily engaged in their own battle to their front. Also at 6 am, in the 30th Division sector, the 89th Brigade flank at Epéville was heavily shelled and attacked in force, both flanks of the brigade being penetrated and forced back from the canal into a rearguard action towards Esmeralon. The attack rolled onto the north flank of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, who held their position and formed defensive flanks facing due north, unleashing a storm of machine gun and rifle fire which brought the German attack to a halt. At 7, and seeing that the 89th Brigade's position was becoming impossible, Division ordered the 90th Brigade to conduct a slow, very deliberate fighting withdrawal almost 4 miles west towards a line astride the La Lemagne stream, midway between Esmeralon and Somme, to allow enough time for the division's artillery and support units to retire behind the Canal du Nord to their west. Now at the exposed eastern edge of the British lines and unsupported by artillery, the Royal Scots Fusiliers held the northern section of the lines from the 89th Brigade's flank around the Somme-Esmeralon road, with the Bedfords extending from Villette to the 36th Division's flank around Bonneville Farm. The line was extremely thin, but held the German infantry at bay, retiring bit by bit and only when outflanked. By 8:30, German troops had advanced along the canal and captured Canisy, forcing the 20th Division troops back to a railway embankment southwest of the village. A local counterattack threw the advancing Germans back into the village, but at the cost of yet another battalion commanding officer, when Lieutenant Colonel Moore of the 12th King's Royal Rifle Corps was killed. By 9 in the morning, German troops had crossed the La Lemagne stream northwest of Verlin and worked their way into the countryside due north of Esmeralon. With the 89th Brigade falling back, German troops moved to within 1,000 yards of Esmeralon, while the 90th Brigade was still stuck in what had become an entirely defensive formation astride the Esmeralon to Somme road, with both flanks refused. 20 minutes later, a German artillery barrage hit positions around the La Lemagne stream, determined to drive the division west so the advance could continue. On the southern flank of the division's lines, the Bedfords came under attack from the flank and rear, German troops having advanced through Golencourt and driven the 36th Division west. There was simply nothing else to do but to take the losses and continue with their deliberate fighting withdrawal. The 21st Brigade had been moved from reserve and into the firing line around Esmeralon, where they came under heavy bombardment around 10 am. Their flanks both gave way, with the centre holding until they had no option but to withdraw. but in the confusion the 2nd Yorkshires were surrounded on all sides northeast of Esmeralon. At 10 a.m. orders also arrived with the 90th Brigade to continue with the fighting withdrawal, aligned with the rest of the division around Esmeralon, and from there to fight their way back to the Canal du Nord. An hour later the first elements of the 90th Brigade started arriving in the Esmeralon line, the German infantry close behind, and German heavy artillery already pounding the area, with some British field guns firing short onto their lines to greet them as well, perhaps thinking they were advancing German troops in the growing confusion. Shortly afterwards, the remaining 30th Division artillery limbered up and rushed back behind the Canal du Nord, leaving the rearguard troops completely unsupported. Fighting continued relentlessly along the Esmeralon line until a heavy machine gun barrage was unleashed on the southern flank of the British defences, forcing the next stage of the retirement to start. At midday, the 90th Brigade diary recorded that the situation at noon appears to be as follows, with the brigade only able to muster 34 officers and 800 men, which included the 14-strong trench mortar section, 66 in brigade headquarters, and 350 men, a full half of the fighting strength, being stragglers from various units who had been folded into the firing line, which also included survivors from the 16th Manchesters. At this stage, the 2nd Royal Scots Fusiliers were recorded as having just 12 officers and 250 men, with the 2nd Bedfords only able to field 7 officers and 134 other ranks. At 12:40, the 89th Brigade, who had been struggling even before the day's events had started to unfold, were ordered by Division to collect a strong counter-attack force. The Brigadier's reply to Division simply read that there was none available, and that his men had no food or water for 2 days, and were not worth anything as fighting troops. By 1 in the afternoon, Esmeralon was in German hands, but French units had started reinforcing the ever-shrinking British units. To the south, French troops had taken over from the British III Corps, with news arriving that the French 10th, 22nd and 62nd Divisions were moving into the Canal du Nord line behind XVIII Corps that afternoon. The 90th Brigade and the growing number of troops had become mixed up with them, provided the rearguard and formed into 4 skirmish lines, slowly withdrawing west as the troops and guns behind them retired across the Canal du Nord. To the north that morning, 19 Corps were also under extreme pressure. At 10:15, 18 Corps were notified that the 8th Division directly to their north had been driven from the heights northwest of Bethencourt. The Corps diary, again rather testily, records, as the 8th Division seemed unable to deal with the situation, then going on to explain that another counter-attack from the 20th Division's 183rd Brigade had regained Bethencourt by 2:45 p.m. By now the 20th Division were holding nearly 2,000 yards of 19 Corps' frontage as well as its own. Repeated efforts to get 19 Corps to assume control were explained in the diary with an almost dismissive part sentence: the troops to do so were not forthcoming. Elsewhere in the 19 Corps area, they were just about holding the German bridgeheads at bay, although their exhausted troops were unable to counterattack, so purely formed defensive flanks to try and hem the bridgeheads in. Multiple divisions in the Corps reported that they were unable to make contact with the units to either flank, so their already thin lines were stretched out further until contact was finally made. It became clear that 19 Corps were unable to hold the German attacks anymore when confidential orders arrived with the overstretched 20th Division after midday to prepare to retire to the line of the Libermont Canal, now called the Canal du Nord, with their northern flank resting on Les Nils-Saint-Nicaise, just north of Nesle. Although the canal line running south from Nesle was defensible, the problem was in the area north of the town, running all the way up to the River Somme as it runs from west to east between Amiens and Péronne. German forces were already across the canal, had momentum and were pressing their advantage into the open countryside. Just after 1 in the afternoon, the 20th Division's southern section of the line started their retirement from the Somme Canal between Offoy and Bethencourt to positions behind the Canal du Nord, where they would initially hold a 4-mile stretch from Nesle to the crossing at Beauvaisis. Seeing the 20th Division's ordered retirement, German troops pressed their advantage, but assaults against Bethencourt and Offoy were beaten back, although their northern flank was still wide open. By 2 p.m, the southern flank of the 8th Division had been driven in to the west of Pot, leaving a yawning gap between them and the 20th Division, although their lines soon stabilised and they repulsed further assaults during the afternoon. To their south, the 30th Division continued their slow rearguard action, and by early to mid-afternoon were holding a line from Ambleu down to Hospital Farm, 1 mile southwest of Esmeralon, and protecting the division's crossing points in the process. Corps diary recorded that the line continued east to a position south of Golencourt, where the 36th Division reported they had linked with French divisions. Although not recorded, presumably a counter-attack or similar had stabilised the lines on the southern Corps borders. perhaps by the newly arrived French troops which had recently relieved 3 Corps. Although 4 companies from the French 22nd Division reinforced the south of the 20th Division's sector of the Canal du Nord line on their arrival, the increasing gap between their northern flank and the 8th Division was recorded in the diary as being critical. The French divisional commander assumed command of the 20th Division, but made no attempt to reinforce the open northern flank. Aligning themselves with the 20th Division's movements, at 1:30 p.m, the brigadier of the 89th Brigade decided to withdraw all troops across the canal, which was carried out in an orderly manner. Once in position, they contented themselves with watching German forces gathering on the eastern bank, although no attack came their way, so supplies, water and ammunition were urgently collected and distributed. By mid-afternoon, the last of the 90th Brigade's rearguard had crossed the bridge at Lannoy Farm and were greeted by a tired but well-organised post lining the canal bank as British artillery and machine gunners opened fire to stop further German advances. The line was desperately short of officers, with many posts and even entire sections of the line being commanded by junior NCOs or privates. In the 90th Brigade sector, the Royal Scots Fusiliers held the Lannoy Farm Bridge on the right, with the Bedfords defending Bedfordshire Bridge on the left. Both battalions were bolstered with whatever mixed-up troops were available to them to bring their numbers up to something approaching fighting strength. In the general 18 Corps area, around 3 p.m, units from the French 10th, 22nd and 62nd Divisions started folding into the British positions along the canal bank in the 3-mile stretch between Kikeri, east of Nesle, and Libermont to the south. The Corps diary recorded that, unfortunately, the French troops were of inferior quality and beside having no artillery only carried 50 rounds of ammunition per man. Although they watched German troops busying themselves across the canal, no serious attacks developed and those which reached the canal banks were easily beaten off, according to the 30th Division's diary. It appeared that the Germans also needed to reorganise again before the next phase of their attacks, so the exhausted British troops did exactly the same. Mixed up units were reorganised, the troops were resupplied with ammunition, 6 new machine guns with fresh machine gunners were brought into place, and food and water arrived. With sheer exhaustion setting in once they stopped moving and fighting, it became harder to keep the men from falling asleep, and constant appeals were made from all levels of command to dig in before resting. In the more open countryside to the north, the 8th Division came under increasing pressure, with flank battalions from various brigades in the 8th and 20th Divisions repeatedly losing touch during the afternoon's fighting. The gap between the 8th and 20th Divisions, around Mesnil-Syndicates, widened as the fighting developed. 18 Corps diary records that, by the evening, the situation on the left flank of the 20th Division had become serious. The 8th Division had withdrawn due west, thus widening the gap already existing. The 20th Division shuffled their line north, with the southern flank now resting on Kikeri. Their most northern brigade, the 183rd, extended their line another mile north, as far as Pot, to try and make contact with the 8th Division. But by now, 18 Corps recorded that they were attempting to hold a line which extended some 4,000 yards beyond its northern boundary. Even after occupying Pot, there was no sign of the 8th Division, and the poor communication continued. Before 9 p.m, contact was made between the 2 divisional headquarters, and the 8th Division's 25th Brigade were ordered into the gap, although just the 22nd Durham Light Infantry arrived in the event, and none of the 150th Brigade units assigned to the task. Later it was learned that the 150th Brigade had been stood down and moved into reserve, the intention being for the 24th Division to take over the gap overnight. The 30th Division were given a temporary respite. At 5:45, news arrived that the 89th and 90th Brigades were to be relieved by the French 62nd Division and were to spend the night in billets. Unfortunately, the French units arrived and relieved just the 89th Brigade section of the line to their south in error, leaving the completely worn-out 90th Brigade troops in position. The 89th Brigade would spend the night and much of the following day in billets as the counter-attack brigade, but the 90th would have no such luck. Moments after the bad news arrived, and with the relief already in progress to their south, a heavy German barrage hit the 90th Brigade's lines, and waves of infantry could be seen lining the eastern side of the canal. British artillery put down an instant defensive barrage and, coupled with heavy fire from the 6 newly arrived machine guns, the attack was broken up before it even reached the canal banks. At 7:30, the 90th Brigade called down a barrage to disperse a concentration of troops to their front, which appeared to stop any attempts of an attack, and a third attempt to storm the Bedfordshire Bridge was launched at 9:30 p.m, again destroyed by artillery, machine gun and rifle fire before they made it across the canal. Corps orders were passed down to hold the canal to the last that evening. Despite the poor condition of the 90th Brigade by this point in the battle, they found themselves in a solid position, with good artillery support and a new batch of machine guns manned by fresh gunners, although they would spend their night being kept awake by the almost constant artillery bombardment against their lines. At least no infantry attacks came at them out of the darkness. But as darkness fell in the north, the 183rd Brigade's open northern flank was heavily attacked, throwing them out of Pot before the expected 24th Division had even arrived. forcing them to form a defensive flank facing northeast, in front of Mesnil-le-Petit, just north of Nesle. 18 Corps diary recorded, "Meanwhile, the situation on the left flank of the corps was serious. There were French battalions scattered about, but they seemed lost and without any definitive orders as to the role they were to play. That evening, General Gough, the commander of the Fifth Army, spoke with the French General Robilot about the gap, who agreed to send 2 companies to support the now serious position on the open flank. They didn't arrive. So the 183rd Brigade counterattacked instead, recaptured Mesnil-Syndicates, and found the 8th Division's flank. Brigadier Hugh Points of the 90th Brigade wrote in his diary overnight, "We have daily been expecting more divisions to come up and help us, but they don't. Up to date, only 2 French battalions have come. It is quite impossible to stop the Boche with our depleted divisions. It is very annoying, as we never ought to give up so much ground. The total strength of my brigade is now about 400 instead of over 2,000. He added as an afterthought how annoying he was finding writing orders as his candles were being blown out by the German aircraft bombing the area. During a night which saw the troops on the ground under artillery fire, but with no significant fighting, commanders on both sides took the opportunity to plan and organise. The newly arrived French generals had been placed in command of the British Corps and ordered them to retire southwest, as their orders were for a general withdrawal to Paris if needed. In doing so, the gap between 19 and 18 Corps would have become catastrophic. The British commanders chose not to obey their orders, and the French, despite being in nominal command, were happy to conform, as their own orders were vague and they were out of touch with the reality of events on the ground. 18 Corps diary records that the French had arrived in haste, disorganised, ill-supplied, and therefore were much less effective than they could have been, but made it clear that it was through no fault of their own. Higher up the food chain, Generals Gough and Robilot had agreed to counter-attack the area under threat, the intention being to send the infantry in before daybreak. To that end, frantic British preparations saw the barrage organised, ammunition and stores moved into position, the infantry were concentrated and orders issued. Daybreak arrived, but the French troops didn't. Fraught discussions resulted in the French asking for a 3-hour postponement, which was agreed. 3 hours later there were still no French troops. When questioned by some very agitated British generals, the French commanders responded that it had only been a project and never intended as real business. The gap between the 8th and 20th Divisions remained undefended. As morning arrived, the 18 Corps line was manned with the 20th Division from Mesnil-Syndicates, 1 mile north of Nesle, and nominally in touch with the 8th Division through a string of scattered and very isolated posts to the canal at Kikeri. From the canal was the 20th Division and French 22nd Divisions down to Bedfordshires. The 30th Division held the line from there to the bend in the canal along with elements of the French 62nd Division. The French 62nd Division held from the canal bend southwards. French troops had come into the line east of Libermont to the south, so by now the southernmost British unit on the entire battlefield was the 90th Brigade south of Bedfordshire. The 36th Division had been relieved overnight and were in support under the command of the French 62nd Division. German scouts and aircraft must have spotted the situation between the 8th and 20th Divisions, as at daybreak a heavy German attack went in against the overstretched and outflanked 8th Division. By 7:45 a.m. the 24th Brigade on the south of the line worryingly reported that their right had been broken. Soon afterwards, news arrived with the 8th Division headquarters that both of the brigade's flanks had been turned, and they requested a counterattack. All available reserves were rushed in, those being a single, very worn battalion from the 150th Brigade, some corps cyclists, and an armoured car. Before the attack had even arrived, more reports filtered through that several battalions within the division were forming defensive flanks, and that gaps were opening all along the division's lines. At 8:30, a German breakthrough at Licourt, 2 miles north of Nesle, was reported, but the position was regained later that morning. Half an hour later, German troops found the northern flank of the 20th Division and forced them back to high ground 1,000 yards west of Nesle, prizing the gap open even further. The division's line now facing almost due north, stormtroopers and the supporting infantry manoeuvred their way around the open western flank near Herly, due west of Nesle, and sent the survivors retiring southeast towards Billancourt. The 20th Division troops lining the canal bank southeast of Nesle, around Kikeri, held their ground despite their rear being in danger, effectively forming the hinge of the opening door to their west. 18 Corps was slowly and deliberately being surrounded. To the south in the 30th Division area, the Bedfords around Bedfordshire watched German forces massing for their assault, the British artillery firing almost continuously as they did so. The Brigadier Hugh Points wrote in his diary how it was very interesting watching them. French artillery joined the bombardment, but many of their shells landed short among the British and French troops on the western banks. At 8:20 the German infantry came. Assaults against the French crossings to the north of the 90th Brigade at Bedfordshire and Breuil were driven off, while light attacks, possibly just demonstrations, against the 90th Brigade lines were easily stopped. The heavy shelling continued from the front, flank and rear, causing heavy casualties and having a demoralising effect on the brigade. Initially blamed on Allied artillery, it was later learned to have come from German batteries which had penetrated deep into the French lines to the south. By 11 a.m. the fighting was raging along the whole British and French line, with repeated attempts to cross the canal in the 90th Brigade's area, all being thrown back with heavy losses inflicted on the attacking troops. The 2nd Royal Scots Fusiliers, holding the southern portion of the brigade lines, were being hard pressed by sheer weight of numbers, and unexpectedly came under enfilade attack from German field guns and machine guns to their south late morning. Half an hour later, reports came in that French troops were retiring from Breuil to their north, and that more fresh German troops were massing east of the 90th Brigade lines. By noon, Corps described the situation as obscure, although to the 90th Brigade it was clear that the flanks to either side of them had been overwhelmed. Soon afterwards, reports arrived of German forces advancing along the Nesle-Roy road, miles behind their fighting lines, and confirmed that Breuil had been lost just to the north of the 30th Division's area. The French 22nd Division and elements of the 30th Division drawn into the fighting on the 90th Brigade's northern flank were fighting a rearguard action southwest towards Moyencourt, with German forces pressing them hard, while fresh German troops crossed the canal at Breuil and advanced due west into the gap created by the French movement to the southwest. Other German units turned to the north and south, the intention being to roll up the now open flanks of those units defending the canal banks. In the north, with a few exceptions, 19 Corps were holding on to the canal line, but the situation between the 8th and 20th Divisions had become critical. Elements of the 8th Division, intermingled with various French units, were falling back in the face of a massive assault, the French moving southwest and adding to the confusion. The battle-worn 61st Brigade were hurriedly bussed onto the open flank of the 20th Division to stem the tide. Despite being only 450 strong, they checked the German forces for long enough for the 20th Division troops to extricate themselves, the division reforming and continuing a fighting withdrawal until passing through a French division forming a rearguard line to the west, then moving northwest to support the 8th Division. With no reserves left and it becoming clear that a withdrawal from the Canal du Nord line was unavoidable, several thrown-together units were formed behind 19 Corps' fighting lines to the north, to provide the fighting divisions a line to fall back through later that evening. Back in the 30th Division's area, a heavy assault was launched against the division, Brigadier Points of the 90th Brigade recording the event in his personal diary. At 2 p.m. he started the attack in earnest, coming on in dense waves extending to about 3 paces between the men. Their machine guns, of which they had hundreds, had by this time got close up to the canal and were plastering our trenches with machine gun fire. Low-flying aeroplanes were very bold and kept continually hovering about and firing into our front trenches. Our men wasted much ammunition on them, and we found it very hard to stop them firing at them, as they were only about 200 feet up. And he continued, the men did splendidly and stopped many attempts to cross our bridges and inflicted heavy casualties. The shelling was very bad, and we were enfiladed from our right flank as the Boche had succeeded in forcing the bridge at Libermont, about a mile south of us. Things began to look very bad as the Boche had also succeeded in crossing the canal about a mile to the north of us also, and we could see our men retiring. We continued to hold them until about 5 p.m. when French infantry battalion next to us on the right suddenly retired to a position further back without telling us they were going. They also failed to blow up the bridge, which we had prepared for demolition before handing over to them the night before. Consequently, the Boche swarmed over their bridge, which we could not see, and the Scots Fusiliers suddenly found Boche cavalry charging into their trenches from their right flank. The Royal Scots Fusiliers diary records that the French 62nd Division to their south retired at about 2:30, leaving them isolated, so they hurriedly formed a defensive flank. Orders to retire arrived soon afterwards from the French 22nd Division, who were nominally in command of the 30th Division from 3 p.m. onwards. The reality was that withdrawal was simply not feasible at that moment, so the brigade stuck to it and continued fighting. With the 90th Brigade in an increasingly sticky situation, a French rearguard line was formed between Moyencourt and Urshu, and the 89th Brigade to their rear were ordered into billets at Roy-Glise, 1 mile south of Roy. Along the canal, the 2nd Bedfords contracted and refused both flanks with what men were available, but continued holding the canal line. On 19 Corps front in the north, fighting had continued all day, with German troops forming reinforced bridgeheads in several points along the Canal du Nord line. At 4:15, orders were issued for the retirement to a new line running from Frise on the banks of the River Somme to Chaulnes, some 7 miles to the south. Their withdrawal started as dusk arrived, with many units of the 8th Division stumbling into German troops behind them along the way. In the 30th Division's area, the 90th Brigade were finally ordered by division to start their withdrawal at 4:30 through the French lines to their rear. Delaying actions were fought as troops negotiated their way through the marshy ground to their rear, under the constant attentions of numerous German machine guns which had got onto their open flanks and the ever-present artillery. The division's diary records that the 90th Brigade lost heavily in this withdrawal. The enemy had crossed the canal to the south and worked up machine guns close to their right flank. Passing through the French rearguard line to their west, the surviving 90th Brigade troops marched to Solent, where buses greeted them, and moved them to the division's concentration area at Rueilly. Here, a hot meal was served, ammunition made up, and after a short rest the division was bussed to Arvillers, arriving at midnight. The 20th Division also started trying to disengage, fighting a rearguard action southwest into the countryside north and east of Roye. That 19 Corps war diary recorded that most of the 40 battalions in the Corps were down to an average of 200 men. As for the 90th Brigade specifically, the 16th Manchesters had seen just 8 wounded men rejoin their lines from the forward zone defence on the opening day, and 593 were listed as missing. The 2nd Royal Scots Fusiliers had around 200 men left, and the 2nd Bedfords mustered just 150 men. Both the Fusiliers and Bedfords numbers included those stragglers folded into their ranks during the day, so the losses during the day's fighting are unclear. The 18 Corps war diary added that the surplus personnel of divisions kept out of action had been removed to Caen and kept there to enable divisions to have something with which to rebuild their depleted battalions. 5th Army Headquarters had ordered them to be made into 3 composite battalions and handed over to 19 Corps to fight on that corps' front. They left on the evening of the 25th of March and, to quote the diary, were lost to 18 Corps altogether. The Corps diary also remarked how the French generals, through no fault of their own, were at first unable to exercise command in the field, either over their own or our troops. They had been sent up in a great hurry. They arrived on the scene with a pencil and a notebook, but without their staffs, without telephones or dispatch riders, without artillery, and without any small arm ammunition beyond the 50 rounds carried by the men. They were short of transport and short of machine guns, and this state of things lasted several days. French orders to the British units were, to quote the diary, contradictory, so decisions were sometimes made on the fly, driven by the local situation rather than a vague order from their superiors, which had often been countermanded by somebody else in a senior position anyway. It closes by recording that it should be placed on record that a 10-mile gap was only avoided by the firmness of purpose displayed by General Sir Hubert Gough. In the north, 19 Corps withdrew overnight, arriving in the new lines by 6 a.m. the following morning. It had certainly been a close-run thing, but the combined British and French forces had just about managed to stop a German breakthrough. But they weren't out of the woods yet.